So good evening or good morning, everyone. My name is Daniela Osatsky-Stern, and I would like to welcome all of you again to the virtual space of the Western Galilee College, the Holocaust Studies program. We have become, we made this event a tradition this last year, an international discussion of Holocaust scholars. Yesterday, we marked the International Women's Day, and today we are gathering to talk about new trends in women and gender issues during the Holocaust. No doubt this topic is important and unfortunately has been under-researched for many years. I can give you just one of many examples from my own research on Jewish partisans, during which I encountered dozens of testimonies of female partisans who spoke frankly about their experiences as women in the forest. Many of them had been left out of the mainstream historiography. We all follow new works and initiatives in this field, and tonight we are lucky to have with us just several of the leading scholars who are kind enough to share with us some of their ideas and findings. Some technical notes. We are recording this session and will upload it to our website, and please keep your microphones on mute. As always, I want to thank Dr. Boaz Cohen, Dr. Ronnie Mikkel Arieli, Jan Bujlaf, and Dr. Yaron Pasher from the organizing team. Ronnie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's like always a pleasure to see so many familiar and as well as unfamiliar faces with us today. I can see people from South Africa, from India, from the US, from Canada, from all over Europe. So welcome. I actually remember, I think it was 2 months ago when we started thinking about this event. And I think it's very exciting to have all of you here with us. And I would like, without further ado, to present our keynote speaker, our opening lecturer, Professor Marion Kaplan. Is a professor of modern Jewish history at NYU. She's a 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner for The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, and Gender and Jewish History, as well as a finalist for Dominican Heaven, the Jewish refugee settlement in Soswa. Her other monographs include the Jewish feminist movement in Germany, Jewish daily life in Germany, 1618 to 1945. She has also edited several books on German Jewish and women's history, and has taught courses on German Jewish history, European women's history, German and European history, as well as European Jewish history and Jewish women history. Today, Professor Kaplan will give her opening lecture titled Gendering Holocaust Studies, Looking Back and Forward. Professor Kaplan, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and happy belated International Women's Day to everybody. Okay, I will start with my talk, and I will time myself. Okay. looking back on the past 3 decades of historical studies on Jewish women and the Holocaust is no small task. I started my own research in the 1970s with a study of the German Jewish feminist movement, and with another book that analyzed women's roles in Jewish families in late 19th century Germany. By the early 1990s, the field of women in the Holocaust had just begun. My own interest, stemming from my family history, my parents had been refugees from Nazi Germany, and from my earlier engagement with the women's movement as a graduate student at Columbia, led me to the field. It took a while for me to gain the courage to address Jewish women and families in Nazi Germany. It felt too close. Still, as with my other scholarship, I wondered, might women have experienced this era differently than men? And if so, how? The early pioneers of this field assumed yes, but we needed to do the research. I will start there, but first a historical reminder. 1980s feminists may have propagated this agenda, but questions about gender arose long before we knew it. Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum's collection of testimonies, reports, and surveys in the Warsaw Ghetto, later known as the Onek Shabbat Project, asked questions of and about women, and many of the collectors were women. Polish Jewish historian Philip Friedman, who survived Lvov in hiding, set an agenda for future research as early as 1945, including the biological impact of starvation, statistics of biological destruction, the disintegration of the family, on and on. The first large-scale research impetus came in 1983, and that's the first PowerPoint that you're seeing. I had the privilege to participate in a path-breaking conference coordinated by Joan Ringelheim and Esther Katz in New York City, entitled Women Surviving the Holocaust. For 2 days, 400 survivors and female scholars, as well as 2 male scholars, tried to figure out whether, and if so, how, gender mattered. At points, we broke into small groups, and I had the opportunity of taking notes in one survivor's group. I recall my surprise and confusion when many survivors both rejected the salience of gender and highlighted it. In other words, these older women claimed being a woman did not matter, and then described how indeed it mattered. I thought then, and still think, that many survivors did not want to support a feminist inquiry, and yet hope to tell their stories for posterity. That same year, if you look at PowerPoint 3 and then 4, that same year, this is the conference. Vera Alaska, herself a survivor, published her Women in the Resistance and Holocaust, 1983, using women's published testimonies. And if you look at number 5, the woman smiling is Ilse Blumenthal-Weiss, who survived Theresienstadt with her daughter, but lost her husband and son in the Holocaust. 12 years after that first foray, Dahlia Ofer and Leonora Weitzman organized the International Workshop on Women in the Holocaust at the Hebrew University in 1995. Why did it take so long? The short answer, scholars needed to do the research that connected women's history, feminist theory, and the Holocaust. This took time. In the 1990s, for example, Lessons and Legacies of the Holocaust, published by the Holocaust Educational Foundation, offered just 2 articles about women in the first volumes spanning the 1990s. That's Claudia Kuhn's in volume 1 and Judy Baumel in volume 2. Scholars' focus on Jewish women caused some opposition in the 1990s, part of a conservative backlash against feminism. One critic accused women's and female gender studies scholars of enacting a, quote, macabre sisterhood with the dead Jewish women of Europe, and others faulted feminists for using the Holocaust for their, quote, own agendas. Specifically, these critics saw gender analysis as privileging women, that is, raising women's suffering above that of men. and they maintained that women's experiences were irrelevant or even irreverent. Thankfully, this debate died down pretty quickly. Indeed, women's historians had always underlined that being Jewish mattered first and foremost. But as Joan Ringelheim wrote, quote, "The end, namely annihilation or death, does not describe or explain the process." Mary Felstener specified that along the stations toward extinction, quote, "each gender lived its own journey." I added rather defensively, probably appropriately for 1998, quote, "To raise the issue of gender can never place blame on other survivors for the disproportionate deaths of Jewish women. Blame rests with the murderers. To raise the issue of gender also does not place it above racism. We know that the Nazis did not want to, quote, share the earth with the Jewish people. However, gender helps to tell a fuller, more intimate, and more nuanced story. It gives Jewish women a voice long denied them, and a perspective long denied us. And I believe that to this day. Research on Jewish women did not occur in a void. American and European women's historians began publishing on a wide variety of topics linked to women's history. For example, Becoming Visible, Women in European History. Historians in the mid-1970s also began to explore women in Nazi society, especially German non-Jewish women. And number 6 is Claudia Kunz's Mothers in the Fatherland slide. In the 1980s, Claudia Kunz, as well as Renata Breidenthal, Atina Grossman, and I, in a book called When Biology Became Destiny, that's number 7, continued to research German women, but also included Jewish women in these histories, but separately. These books coincided with and were greatly influenced by the scholarship of women's history, as well as its entry and women's entry into the academy. And I underline women's entry. I don't think it would have happened otherwise. How did scholars write these histories? First, we needed to discover materials in newspapers, government archives, organizational archives. Many also turned to memoirs, diaries, letters, and interviews as crucial first-person evidence. Reapplying the feminist motto, "the personal is political," many historians insisted that the personal was also historical, that without women's memories, we missed half the history of the Holocaust. More specifically, without women's memories, we miss the familial and domestic aspects of the Holocaust, but also the gendered public behaviors and humiliations, as well as gendered persecutions in ghettos and camps. Indeed, Beverley Chalmers, who you'll hear later, concluded the diaries and memoirs dating from the war and post-war years are the 2 major sources regarding pregnancy, birth, and sexuality. In addition, comparing personal testimonies of both Jewish women and men makes gender an obvious, really an inescapable lens. The conference I mentioned in 1995, and that's PowerPoint number 8, opened new research avenues, including the history of Jewish women and families before the war in both Western and Eastern Europe, women's struggles in ghettos, camps, and the resistance, and women's accounts in Holocaust literature. Most of these topics focused on women rather than on comparative gender analyses, but some did that as well. These themes set the stage for the next 20 years of studies. Researchers, myself included, benefited from the topics raised at this event, the sources suggested, the creative energy bursting from the conference itself. Ofer and Weitzman's Women and the Holocaust came out 3 years later. That's PowerPoint 9. As did Judith Tidor Baumel's Gender and the Holocaust. This brings me to the topic I delivered at that conference, out of which grew my book, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, and that's PowerPoint 10. Please bear with me as I use my own work to highlight a few major gender differences that emerged. Although the calamity that hit German Jews affected them as Jews first, they also suffered based on gender. At first, Jewish men were far more vulnerable to physical assault and arrest, and women remained to carry the burden of maintaining homes and families. Even if ultimately Jewish women were also enemies doomed to perish in the Nazis' race war. Not only was early Nazi racism and persecution gendered, so too were the victims' survival strategies in practical and psychological terms. The victims reacted not only as Jews, but as men and women. A focus on women led me to recognize, for example, that in contrast to men, most women took the early warning signals far more seriously, adjusting to the abrupt changes in law and culture imposed by the Nazi Party and embraced by non-Jewish Germans. Women eagerly trained for jobs and crafts useful abroad, whereas men hoped they would be able to maintain their businesses, careers, or professions. And at home, women made do on smaller budgets, shopped in hostile stores, and tried to create cheer in cramped spaces, while husbands were asked only to limit their expectations. Finally, many women became breadwinners, often for the very first time, as husbands lost their businesses or jobs. Gender made an enormous difference in deciding between fight and flight. In the early years, Jewish women were more sensitive to discrimination, more eager to leave Germany, more willing to face uncertainty and lower class status abroad, rather than discrimination and ostracism at home. Jewish men thought they had a great deal more to lose by fleeing. Over 80% of Germany's approximately 525,000 Jews lived solid middle-class lives. These men had to tear themselves away from their life work, whether a business or professional practice. Usually more educated than women, many men felt a deep attachment to German culture. And additionally, many had fought in World War I and believed their service would count for something. Most importantly, since middle-class men had previously been the primary breadwinners, as long as they made a living, they were unwilling to face poverty abroad. In light of men's primary identity with their occupation, they often felt trapped into staying. Women, whose identity was more family-oriented, struggled to preserve what was central to them by fleeing with it. Still, until November 1938, some of those men who had not lost their jobs and businesses remained, either hoping the regime would collapse or trying to get the documents necessary to flee. In addition, different experiences in the world of work, men and women also led different lives and often interpreted daily events differently. Women were more integrated into the communities. They noticed daily interactions with neighbors, with the grocer, and with diminishing participation in women's groups. Raised to be sensitive to social situations, their social antennae were finely tuned and also directed toward more unconventional, what men might have considered more trivial sources of information. What the baker said, whether the neighbor gave her usual hello. Men mediated their experiences through newspapers and broadcasts, whereas women's narrower picture, the minutiae and significance of direct everyday contact, brought politics home. Women also seem to have been acutely aware of children's unhappiness, another reason to flee. When children suffered from abuse at school, mothers and fathers often disagreed as to the solution. Tony Lessler, the founder and director of a Montessori school in Berlin, forcibly turned into a Jewish school, remembered, quote, "The city schools became ever more difficult for the Jewish children, and it may have been false pride that caused the fathers in particular to keep their children in city schools." Lessler pointed not only to fathers' aspirations to give their children a quality education, but also to their stand tough approach. Memoirs furthermore attest to fathers' unrealistic hopes that the children would not suffer, and to their insistence that they develop, quote, thicker skin. Recalling debates within Berlin Jewish families, Peter Wyden summed up, quote, "It was not a bit unusual in these go or no-go family dilemmas for the women to display more energy and enterprise than the men. Almost no women had a business, a law office, or a medical practice to lose. They were less status conscious, less money oriented. They seemed to be less rigid, less cautious, more confident of their ability to flourish on new turf." Finally, I noticed that women's perspectives highlighted entirely new public and private dimensions of history. For example, men wrote of the public spectacle of the November pogrom of 1938, smashed shops, burning synagogues, the lasting impression of broken glass in the streets. Most of what we've learned about the November pogrom comes from precisely these public images. A powerful image, mentioned often and only in Jewish women's memoirs, is that of flying feathers covering private internal spaces, the home, hallway, and courtyard. It took until 2019 for a new book on Kristallnacht. You can turn to the next PowerPoint, number 11, edited by Wolf Gruner and Stephen Ross, to offer more research on interior spaces and to put a photo of SA men destroying a living room on the front cover of their new book. Similar to pogroms in Russia at the turn of the century, the marauders destroyed furniture, tore up goose feather blankets and pillows, shaking them into the rooms, out the windows, and down the stairs. Bereft of their bedding, Jews lost the kind of physical and psychological security and comfort that this represented. In addition, they could no longer replace those items due to the cost and the looming war economy. Broken glass in public and strewn feather beds in private spelled the end of Jewish family life and security in Germany. Gender differences in perceiving danger accompany gender role reversals. In what Raoul Hilberg described as communities of men without power and women without support, we find, for the most part, anxious but active women who early on greatly expanded their traditional roles. One example will have to suffice. It focuses on the November pogrom.
Impartial juror for a George Floyd case.
Can I listen? Can I listen?
Are you eating or not?
Okay, I'll start again. It focuses on the November pogrom, highlighting women's activities under dire circumstances. While destroying Jewish property, the marauders also beat and arrested about 30,000 men, interning them in concentration camps. There were exceptions. Some women were publicly humiliated, beaten, and murdered, but most women were forced to stand by and watch. Later, women summoned the courage to overcome gender stereotypes of passivity in order to find any means to free men from camps. Ruth Abraham, and that's PowerPoint 12, impressed her family, but also the Nazis with her determination. During the pogrom, she pulled her fiancé out of his store and led him through the teeming crowds. Then she traveled to Dachau to ask for the release of her future father-in-law. Arriving in a bus filled with Hitler's elite troop, the SS, she entered the camp, where they ignored her. She assumed that because of her, quote, Aryan looks, her light hair and blue eyes, those in charge took her for a member of the League of German Girls. She requested an interview with the commandant and begged for the release of her father-in-law. She succeeded again, attributing her success to her looks, since the men who helped her refused to believe she was a full, quote, full Jew, and seemed to take pity on her. Abraham's highly unconventional behavior found a more conventional reward. The couple married immediately. The rabbi who performed the ceremony did so with bandaged hands, an indication of the treatment he had received in a concentration camp. Even though women transcended certain gender roles, gender as such caused serious consequences in emigration. Gender made a difference in matters of life and death. For example, more women than men were trapped in Nazi Germany. There are many explanations for that, and somebody can ask me later, but I want to move on because I see time is running out. These were some of the early takeaways with regard to gender at the grassroots. I found that the genders often perceived and reacted to the same events differently, and gender could also be a matter of life and death. What happened in the next 20 years? To this day, there seems to be a good deal of social history and women's history, including local histories of Eastern and Western Europe and histories of camps and ghettos. Often these social and women's histories include women, but are not consciously about gender. If we approach topics in a gendered way, might it change our narratives? Holocaust historians, especially male historians, rarely ask how women experienced aspects of the Holocaust differently from men, or how this might change our understandings. Literary scholars do this more often. They ask gendered questions of their texts, whether autobiographies or fictions. They come to the text with a particular interest in gender and women. But fewer historians seem to go beyond including women, and I would add, including a few women. Still, some promising research has appeared lately. I can't go into all of it. I'll mention a few. I'll start with histories of Eastern Europe that Natalia Alexian kindly shared with me. For example, there is new work on Jewish women inside and outside of the Krakow ghetto, which includes family life and women's strategies of survival on the Aryan side. Women hiding in bunkers, social roles in ghettos, more testimonies and literary perspectives, and work on individual women like Rachel Auerbach of the Warsaw Ghetto, based on her diary and literary work. In addition, autobiographies have flourished. In 2009, Louise Vasvari gathered 400 entries of women's life writing from Central and Eastern Europe. And these are only the ones in English. That was the result of a boom in such writings that occurred after years of mostly remaining unpublished. Research on sexualities and the body have made significant progress in the last years, mostly as women's history. Back in 1993, Claudia Schupman addressed how the Nazis targeted lesbians, and we can find lesbians and the Holocaust noted in studies in the Shoah in 1999. But we need far more research, and taboos make this difficult. Still, books about same-sex desire exist, and if you turn to number 14, I've used MA and Jaguar in teaching and hope to translate parts of a relatively new book in the series Jewish Miniatures that focuses on another couple, Marta Halusa and Margaret Liu. A bibliography of lesbian and trans women by Anna Haikova lists close to 150 titles. Also, queer history itself, as well as how that research can answer questions about women's lives, should be addressed, though these topics get harder to research as time passes, since the numbers were much smaller than the general survivor population to begin with. Endangered as Jews, women also experience sexual vulnerability. Sexual violation often started with sexual humiliation, nudity, shaving. Anthropologists have pointed out that we need to understand violence not solely as a physical, but as an attack on the humanity, the personhood of individuals. In camps, for example, many daughters had never seen their mothers undressed and then in front of male guards, nor had most women ever shaved their heads. One survivor wrote of the blow to her morale, quote, "We could have been shot, gassed, and yet this single act of German brutality constituted a sacrilegious act on our bodies, our only possessions." This may have affected religious women even more. Men too were shaved, but in general spoke far less about sexual violation or worried about nudity. The sexual economy and sexual barter need further exploration as well. Recent work on Theresienstadt, for example, highlights the power dynamics of unequal relationships, but is also stymied by taboos. Many survivors, male and female, saw women's sexual victimization as a stigma to be concealed. If you go to PowerPoint 15, you will see a snapshot of the film, Long is the Road, shot on location in a Jewish DP camp in Germany in 1947. It offers a powerful example. The young woman in the film wants to confide to her male partner about something that happened to her during the war. But the man gently hushes her and tells her it's better to forget. Viewers understand that he hopes she will stop dwelling on her trauma, assumed to be rape or sexual barter, but also that he does not want to know. If or when there was a sexual barter, how do we understand this? As a choice or a choiceless choice? Perhaps the memoir, and this is PowerPoint 16, of Marie Jalowitz Simon, published in 2015, so just recently, can offer some clues. Born to a middle-class Jewish family, she was only 20, young, slight, and pretty when she decided to go underground in 1942. Luckily, some non-Jews helped her throughout her subterfuge as a half-Jew in Berlin, but her sexual relations with men made a decisive difference in her survival. A Bulgarian painter actually fell in love with her and offered to take her to Bulgaria. She agreed, hoping to make her way to Palestine from there, but those plans fell through. Still, she spent safe weeks with this man, whom she also considered her lover, although she realized they would never share a future if she survived. She had several other relationships as well, and her last one, 2 years long, involved a Dutch worker who had come to Germany on his own before the Dutch forced laborers. He was a strong anti-Nazi. An intermediary told this inexperienced young man that Marie would be his sexual liberation and that she would keep house for him. She saw him as a safe haven. They lived as a couple, although he occasionally hit her, angry at her love of reading. He could also be, quote, pleasant and considerate, and they had a lot to talk about with regard to the war. How do you analyze this story? I asked before, are these choices or choiceless choices? How do historians, even victims, distinguish between forced and consensual relationships, when these could mean the difference between life and death? I do not have an answer. The interesting and arresting part of Simon's story is that she understood her situation, bartering sex for safety, and still sometimes even liked the men she was with. In no sense did she see herself as purely a victim of the men, even when she let one of them, quote, have his way. She took a dim view of her circumstances with men, but survival remained foremost. She makes it very clear that she was a victim, not of these men, but of the Nazis. If I have a few more minutes, I would go into the newest research. What do you think, Roni?
Sure.
Okay.
Go for it.
All right, newest research. So rape now an object of scholarly inquiry, took many years for scholars to address, not only because of taboos. Sarah Cushman wrote of the difficulty of representing sexuality without crossing the line to pornography. Yet she also reminded us of Elizabeth Heinemann's assertion that, quote, failure to investigate evidence that appears time and time again is, in an academic sense, bad scholarship. In a moral sense, it disregards the imperative, both to commemorate past victims and to prevent future atrocities. Sources were and are available. I think you'll hear of some this afternoon or this evening, but they're complicated and scattered. Older testimonies do exist. Still, we need an ensemble of data from victims, witnesses, and perpetrators. To confound matters further, much of this testimony is partial and some of it's unclear. Nazi documents, army cases, post-war trials of perpetrators have their own issues, although they need to be used with care. Scholars like Regina Mühlhauser, Zoe Waxman, and Beverley Chalmers, among others, have raised these topics and offered many examples. I would argue that their work should not only be seen as specialized histories of rape during war, but as Holocaust scholarship. Further, substantiating this notion, David Cesarani, in his 1,000-page book, The Final Solution, showed that almost every atrocity against Jews in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine included rape and sexualized violence against Jewish women, sometimes by Germans, sometimes by their local helpers. Who were the main perpetrators of rapes against Jewish victims? Research highlights the Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht as perpetrators, particularly after the beginning of the War of Annihilation against the Soviet Union. Some of this information comes from later testimonies of German soldiers, since rapists often killed the victims. Other German soldiers proved reluctant to talk about these events even after the war, either to avoid being seen as brutal or for fear of admitting to what the Nazis had termed Rassenschande, racial shame. Yet new research makes absolutely clear we can no longer accept this racial shame as an excuse, since it did not, as a rule, inhibit sexual contact. Inside Germany, courts treated this transgression harshly, but most soldiers got away with it at the Eastern Front. In other words, rape may not have been part of the Nazis' original genocidal plans, but it became, as Mulhauser says, a normal part of everyday warfare. Looking ahead, I would like to raise some areas that need further attention, both older and newer historical fields. And now I'm going to list them because we're running out of time. Aryan women, whom I've not discussed, but who many see as second-tier agents of terror, to quote Doris Bergen, need further investigation despite the good work recently done in that field. In addition, Aryan women made up a majority of the Rosenstrasse crowds, those people who tried to bring their Jewish husbands back from the camps in Berlin in 1943. I would also like to see more actual gender research, real contrast between women and men, and integrated history. And I, for one, have not done that, but I would love to see it. This would include masculinity studies as well as how class or ethnicity was expressed through gender roles. There's been very important research recently on women's bonding experience and camp sisters. And we need more of that and more comparison with males. We've seen young girls adopted by female strangers or by girls from their hometowns. We know Ruth Kluger's mother adopted a daughter in Auschwitz. The three survived together and remained a family once in the US. How widespread was this? Do we see similar relationships among men besides Primo Levi, who does have a close relationship? I also see family histories as opportunity to highlight gendered reactions when faced with persecution. And the history of mothering during the Holocaust needs more attention. One camp survivor repeated as a mantra, quote, "I had a mother, I had a mother," underlining how her mother made the difference between her life and death. How did mothers manage to do this, to flee, to clean, to nurture children, not just as survivors, but also as refugees? For example, Leah Lazigo, with 2 children and a 3-month-old infant, climbed the Pyrenees on foot in 1943. She arrived in Lisbon in time to have the children sent to the US. So here the issue is not just that gender roles prove malleable, but that women often performed roles expected of men and sometimes vice versa. I think I'll leave it here. I've gone 5 minutes over, and I left out the history of emotions, which I think is a new wave that needs looking at. And I will thank you now for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan. It was
You're
fascinating talk. And I think I'll take the opportunity to be the first to ask a question. And I will invite all of you and the audience to pose your questions through the chat. But as you know, I'm working on a project on the deportation to Mauritius. And you mentioned gender and Jewish immigration. And of course, your most recent book on Hitler's Jewish refugees, hope and anxiety in Portugal. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on this aspect as well.
On the aspect of gender
and
refugees?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a whole other talk, but briefly, what I noticed when I did my work on life in Nazi Germany was that gender is very clearly made upside down. In other words, that the gender roles reversed in many cases. And I, gave you a few examples now, but there are many, many cases. What I noticed among refugees, aside from the fact that women often on their own, because their men were in hiding or their men were in camps, did cross the Pyrenees, did try to, escape with their children, but mostly I see gender flattening among refugees. They're both unemployed. She was maybe never employed, but, worked in the home, but they're both unemployed. Their statuses have both shrunk dramatically, disastrously. They don't have money. They have nothing. They're just partners. And so they argue and they discuss and they try to figure out, now we're in Paris, the Germans are coming, what do? We get on our bikes, or we walk with our feet, or we try to get on a crowded train. They seem to be much more partnership. And that happens in Lisbon too. She stands on one consulate line, he stands on another consulate line. They share the work in a way that I don't think happened earlier, or that was, as I said, upside down during the Nazi period in Germany. So there's a lot of that. Nobody can work. Refugees are not allowed to work in Portugal. That's against the rules. So they sit in cafes. They write letters to their families back home. They receive letters from Eastern Europe, from Theresienstadt, from the Warsaw Ghetto, from Berlin, etc. So my sense is it flattened a lot. However, social workers noticed that when the Portuguese got tired of all these refugees in Lisbon, they deported them to small fishing villages in the north of Lisbon, not in the north, but north of Lisbon, where they were kind of imprisoned. It was called a fixed residence. They were not allowed to leave the fishing villages, but they could walk around the villages. The women tended to somehow make themselves busy, whether in the household, whether taking in laundry from other refugees, knitting, having knitting circles, sending packages of food to Central Europe or Eastern Europe. And the men tended to be depressed. And that is not so striking because there's a wonderful sociological study of unemployed men during the Depression in Austria. And I'm forgetting the name, but Claudia, if you're still there, help me out. It's a beautiful essay. Anyway, point being, the men were always depressed and the women were trying to stay active. The men sort of pushed away even from taking care of the children. So to some extent, there is a gendered reaction. But, and also the other thing is, even in these refugee homes in Portugal, if they manage 6 or 7 people to be in a home, some people describe that the men and women shared the work in the house, which I found interesting as well. The women washed the dishes, I remember, and then I had to take out a snarky sentence after that in my book, which is, no one tells us who dried the dishes. So I assume it was the women as well. But I think there was inequality there. There was a way in which the men and women tried to work together in the home. Many men and women went to soup kitchens. They didn't cook at all. They were impoverished. They didn't have a hot plate in their rooms. So many of them, so again, that equalizes the group. So I think to some extent, I'll be interested to see what happens in Mauritius, because if you have more freedom, if the men can go out, that's one thing. And if they're stuck in a DP camp or in a camp, then I don't know.
Yes, it's
on the one hand, gender always happens. And on the other hand, it can get broader or narrower, I think.
Definitely. As you spoke, I thought that that it's really interesting to think that in Mauritius, most of the suicide cases were, I think, only men committed suicides. So they were all very productive, but still, yeah, that's really interesting. But we have one more question. Jan, do you want to pose it?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this insightful lecture. Good to see everybody. And you already teased a little bit about emotions and the role, the ties and links between emotions and gender. And I know both of us, we talked a little bit about, various concepts that we can, pull from the history of emotions and the different concepts. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this. That would be great.
Okay, so thank you for the question. I do not consider my new book a history of emotions. The difference is I call it an emotional history of fleeing, because I was much more interested in the refugees and less interested just in emotions. So I talk a lot about emotions, but I'm talking about everything, practical things, daily life, the fact that there's one person writes, my son can't wear his shoes anymore. Now that's because the son is growing, they have no money, so they stay in the pension room and they can't go out because he can't walk. That of course has an emotional aspect to it, but it has a very practical aspect too. They have to go to the aid organization and beg for new shoes. So I didn't want, if I did an emotional history, I guess my emotional history would have had to be anxiety, getting out. And I didn't want to do that because what I saw in the refugees was hope and anxiety. They were very hard at work to get out. They didn't just sit around. I mean, yeah, they sat around, smoked cigarettes and worried in cafes, but they stood on lines. They wrote petitions. They wrote to everybody and his uncle with their last name in the New York telephone book. I mean, they were doing stuff all the time and they were in hope. So I would have had to do anxiety and hope. And I don't know, it felt too reductive to me. I wanted to tell the whole story. So I think that's the difference. When I started reading History of Emotions, which I find fascinating, there's like a book called Fear. And it describes, that's the one I think on the French Revolution. Yeah, that it describes fear. I didn't want to do that. So I think that's the answer. I was doing an emotional history, not a fleeing, not a history of emotions. And I learned a lot from that field. And I think it's very useful. And maybe some Holocaust scholar will start doing exactly that. But I wouldn't claim that I'm doing it.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm glad if it is.
So I think, do we have any more questions from the audience?
I think I exhausted them.
No, I think, well, if you look at the chat, you'll see that it's the other way around.
I think that Alexandra has a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Hello, and thank you so much also for your research, which guides me in every step. I'm researching Jewish women who stayed in Germany and were active in the cultural life. So those who wrote poetry and literary texts and also worked in the Jüdische Kulturbund. And I have a question because you pointed out about the fact that women were taking over the roles traditionally taken by men. And I have noticed the same mechanism when it comes to women who are publishing in Jewish press in Germany until 1938, that with every year, there were more and more texts by women. And it seems to me, maybe I am wrong, that to some extent, this was also exceptional in terms not only of the German Jewish press, but comparing it to other European newspapers. In this um, Jewish newspapers, I mean, we see many more women writing than, let's say, in Polish Jewish newspapers from the same time period. So to some extent, the fact that a lot of Jewish men writers and journalists left, right? Or at some point, I mean, many of them left, and women had much harder time leaving Germany, which is something you also were pointing out. And that gave women a very unique opportunity to really express what they were going through poetry and novels and short stories. So this is more a thank you, because of you, I started researching it, because I read your book. And then since I'm in literary studies, then I decided to concentrate on literary texts. But of course, you cannot do it without the historical perspective. But do you think that I'm right in saying it, this development?
I think you are right. And I think what's so interesting is that those writers, those famous writers, German, non-Jewish, and Jewish, who left, they didn't have email. They couldn't write for their audiences anymore. Let's say, just talking about life, not talking about fascism. They couldn't write fast enough. They couldn't get it across. The mails were very slow. They would have replaced those women, but they didn't. So those women had more of a chance as the writers left to fill in spaces. And I think that's absolutely the case.
Thank you.
And also, I mean, they did have a harder time leaving. The
Right.
statistics are just, you know, women, and these younger women also, let's say single women who were writing, who were trying to make a living, didn't want to leave their mothers. There's also that whole section that I talked about where they couldn't leave their mothers. So they didn't leave.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for good questions.
And really, I think that it was so interesting and so informative. So thank you, Professor Kaplan, for this fascinating talk. And I really hope that you would be able to join us for the next session. I will just remind you all that we will take a short break of half an hour, so you can refresh, have a coffee, and we will meet again in half an hour for a very, very interesting panel with four fascinating scholars. So I'm really hoping to see all of you here. The Zoom is available. You can just mute yourself and shut your camera, or you can log out and log in with the same link, whatever you prefer. And we're looking forward to seeing you all in half an hour. Enjoy your break. And again, Professor Kaplan, thank you so much. You're muted. Yeah.
Thank you to everybody who attended, and see you later.
That's great. So good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are again. Thank you for joining us on this very special event. And to those of you who came back after the last fascinating session by Professor Kaplan. We are now reaching to our panel, the second part of this event, a panel on new trends and approaches on gender and Holocaust studies. And without further ado, I would like to present the chair of this panel and to give her the floor, of course. Dr. Emily Stiles is a lecturer in modern history at the University of Winchester, where she teaches modern British and European history, including models on Jewish history and the Holocaust. Her work explores memory and representation of the Holocaust, with her first book, Holocaust Memory and National Museums in Britain, due for publication later this year. Congratulations. Dr. Stiles' latest research looks at expressions of power within museum narratives of forced migration, and she is particularly interested in gendered representations of migrant experiences. Dr. Stiles, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invite to come and share this really, really interesting panel. And also, I very much enjoyed the keynote beforehand, so thank you. So we have 3 papers today, and I'm going to suggest that we do all 3 papers and then open up the floor for question. This is in the spirit of scholarship and dialogue. We may find questions that emerge coming from all 3. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker in our first paper. Our first speaker is Professor Andrea Peto. She is professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University in Vienna, Austria, and a Doctor of Science of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Her works on gender, politics, the Holocaust and war have been translated into 23 languages. In 2018, she was awarded the All-European Academy's Madame de Stael Prize for Cultural Values, and she is Doctor Honoris Causa of Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. And I want to introduce the paper today that she will present, which is Gendering Perpetrator Research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me well? Can you give a sign? Excellent. Thank you.
Yes.
So I would like to share my screen with you. And so happy Women's Day. Fantastic that you actually, organize this event. I have got 15 minutes to share with you some interesting insights about this particular research. I wrote 2 books which came out recently about the Holocaust Party, about the invisible perpetrators in the Hungarian Nazi movement, the Holocaust movement, and also a book about the Forgotten Massacre in 1944. And in both books, I try to somehow write in a kind of accessible and kind of easy ways, and that the conclusions I will discuss with you the problems. I mean, what's happening when you are writing a bestseller about these topics. The massacre, the Forgotten Massacre, is actually interesting because that was the first private Holocaust memorial, which was erected in Budapest on the 15th of October 1945. So that's an interesting story, built on press, memoirs, autobiographies, the different people's tribunals materials, different photo archives, and also interviews. So I did lots of interviews with people, tribunal judges, lawyers, investigative officers, survivors, and also perpetrators. So you see that this research has been going on for more than 15 years. So what gives you the inspiration to do a research that actually lasts so long? And then I will talk a little bit about the methodology and the issue of invisibility, and then about the unintended consequences. So what happens when you are writing about the gendered memories of the perpetrators. So I would like to mention 2 inspirations which actually influence my work. First is a kind of historical inspiration that in 2000 I wrote a book based on interviews with neo-Nazi, conservative, far-right women in Hungary, because that was the time in 2000 when all these NGOs were flourishing. And I was, since I'm coming from a very different family, I was wondering, who are these women, where do they come from, and what kind of ideas do they have? And then I want to thank for the interviews here again and for their trust. And this book brought me the prize of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences for original research. And then I wrote a book together with Ildikó Barna about the political justice in Budapest after the Second World War, analyzing 52,000 People's Tribunal's files. And it was pretty obvious that there is a gendered element here. So what is that? The second inspiration is coming from what's happening in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Hungary. And if the events in Hungary are on the main page of the BBC, that's a very bad sign. These were those events in 2006, which actually made the far-right movement and the neo-Nazis visible in the Hungarian context. And it looked like a very male phenomenon, like a testosterone phenomenon. On the other hand, it's there are lots of women who participate in this movement, and this gendered political radicalization actually made a political imperative to ask basically questions about, you know, what is their relationship to the past, where do they come from, are they similar or different? So this photo is the only two photographs I found about the Arrow Cross Party in Hungary, and you see that the women were actually wearing very different uniform than the women of Saló, for example. So they are having skirts. And also the other photo is the main administrative institution. So they are, let's go to the invisibilization, right? So what are the reasons why these women were invisible? First of all, right after 1945, the matriarchy born in need basically normalized those women who were extraordinary. And these women were extraordinary women. And there was no really any kind of need for making them visible. Also, the Cold War logic of the communism and anti-communism basically made all those women who were participating in the as perpetrators as victims of the communist legal process. And the perpetrators were basically equalized with the mob, and everything which, you know, the responsibility was given to the Germans only. But we should not only blame, you know, the circumstances. We should also look at, you know, our own problems, like the blind spots in history writing. First of all, that the political activism, these are, you know, gendered spaces, and they are not producing those documents what the historians are usually happily finding in the archives when the archives are open and there is not a pandemic. So in the case of the Arrow Cross Party, when the Arrow Cross leaders were escaping from Budapest with because of the approaching Red Army, they basically left all the documents of the women's sections behind, and they put all other documents on a truck and moved to the Western occupation, later Western occupational zone, and now it is found in the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in München, and the rest which remained in Budapest maybe resurfaced sometime from a Russian archive, but at the moment it's not available. Also, the glass ceiling and the glass wall has been also present inside the Arrow Cross Party, so therefore there are very little resources available, unless there were some conflicts. And then, you know, these women also, there were lots of cat fights, so these were also producing some documents. The perpetrator research, the fascism research, mostly focusing on the traditional structures, right? And not necessarily those women who were invisible in the structures, and also they were not producing those documents which are available in the archives. And also women and gender history, mostly focusing on the worthy women and not those who are the perpetrators. And I also received lots of criticism from my fellow comrades that why do I waste my precious paid research time on those women instead of writing the history of women, good women, I mean, trustworthy good women. And also the issue of, there has been lots of research about the women, the evilish women who are creating these special extreme women, especially research on the guards of the different concentration camps. This created a special genre, but, and that's an important point I would like to make, it's basically somehow not integrated into the fabric of the different society and the different research in relation to the perpetrators. So that's why these ordinary women who were left out would be, it's interesting, and that's the focus of my two books. What is the specificity in Eastern Europe? After 89, the issue of this double victimhood was the main framework of the history writing. Therefore, women as perpetrators were really not discussed. And if you look at the, I mean, as we did, we looked at the files, and mostly the crimes against the property were committed, those were the crimes committed by women, and the restitution, the issue of restitution had been also a very sensitive and controversial issue. In the post-1989, this counter-memorialization process, these family stories of victimhood are becoming the dominant framework of speaking about the past. And in that framework, the crimes which were committed by these women are basically becoming invisible. And the recent trends, the illiberalization of Eastern Europe, we see that the neoliberal neo-patriarchy, what we see in Eastern Europe after 2008, this also contributed to the masculinization of the profession of historians, and both the topics and also those professionals who would be interested in doing this kind of research are basically missing. And the illiberal turn in memory politics created a need for self-censorship and only presenting women as victims of communism and not as perpetrators. So in my book, I was basically looking at how many members, I mean, how many, this is always the question, right? So 30% of the Holocaust party had been women in some sections. And if you take into consideration that the present Hungarian parliament, there are 10% women, you see that there is, you know, something there which needs to be explained. And that also explained my interest connecting the present day political developments with the kind of historical analogical explanation. 10% of the defendants of the People's Tribunals were women. And the perpetrator category has been extremely complex. Murderer, wives, doctors, administrators, artists, journalists, and so on. So that's also makes a epistemological and also methodological problem for how do you create the category of perpetrator, and how do you find sources to explain that. And I listed it 4 concepts I'm using in my book, theoretical concepts. I mean, historians are usually shy away from theory, but these 4 concepts, which are coming from mostly feminist theory, helps us to understand this resurgence and this unexpected popularity of the far-right mobilization in the 1930s, 40s, and I'm afraid today, which is the issue of agency, the issue of relative power, and also the concept of the patriarchal pact, that perpetuating patriarchy actually contributes gaining power, and also the concept of anti-modernist emancipation, which actually states that there are different forms of emancipation, not only that form of emancipation what the leftist and liberal feminist movements are presenting, but there are other forms of emancipations, and that explains this pretty unexpected popularity of far-right Nazi fascist ideas in the 1930s and even today. So what are the impacts, the unintended consequences? So when I was writing the book in Hungarian first, my purpose was, simple as that, to write a book which is in an accessible language, not using the lingo of neither feminist theory nor history, a book which is it's trying to map the reasons of invisibility, and also the what can historians do to unpack these reasons of invisibility. And actually, I succeeded in writing this book in a kind of popular way. It's a bestseller. It's selling fantastically. But the consequences are that in this book, I was basically introducing the People's Tribunals process, and I was also writing about this the massacre, which was committed by a woman. And and in the Forgotten Massacre, I'm writing about that we really don't know what has happened, how many people were killed because of the lack of sources. And this kind of reflexive, critical history writing is basically not going well in the popular public. So by now, I think that no matter that the book is was written with the best possible intentions of a feminist scholar trying to make women visible and trying to ask the question, what made women becoming perpetrators, murderers, and compliant in making crimes, committing crimes, actually how it ends up and how it is, at the moment looks like in the Hungarian context is basically saying, even Andrea Peto is saying that the People's Tribunals were communist puppet courts, and we don't really know what has happened, so let's close the chapter. But I don't want to finish with this dark closing statement, but I just want to say that writing about perpetrators and gender perpetrators actually giving very particular tasks in this present political climate. And of course, in this particularly in liberal turn and also in the revisionist history writing, we should try to do everything possible to create and to write a history which is challenging those issues of invisibility. So that's what I wanted to share with you, my personal story and my motivation, and I'm really looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting paper to open us up with. Anyone that has any questions, do feel free to start posting in the chat box. We will take those after all three. So the second paper, or our second speaker I will introduce, is Professor Beverley Chalmers. Professor Beverley Chalmers' research examines the birth and sexual experiences of women and children in difficult religious, social, political, and economic situations, including in the Holocaust. She has over 300 publications, including 57 book chapters, 10 books to her credit, and she's given over 460 conference presentations globally. She has undertaken over 140 international health promotion activities in more than 30 countries in the field of perinatal health. Professor Chalmers has 2 doctoral degrees, one in humanities, a PhD in psychology, and the other in medicine in multicultural childbirth. Now an independent scholar, she has held full professorial positions in universities in both Canada and South Africa. And today, Professor Chalmers will be presenting her paper, Sexual Abuse of Women in the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Everything okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I will begin my talk addressing the sexual abuse of women during the Holocaust based on my book, Birth, Sex and Abuse, Women's Voices Under Nazi Rule. The sources for this book really based on the experiences of a few hundred women who lived, and the voices of millions who died are obviously not heard. I went to diaries, to memoirs, testimonies, and archives, and of course, academic studies on women in the Holocaust, very much stimulated by Marion Kaplan's work to begin with too. And I must apologize at the beginning, there's no nice way of reporting the horrors of the Holocaust. The voices of women reveal a specter of brutality that is often laced with misogynistic enjoyment, and that does come through, and there's no way around it really. We've heard a lot about the direct causes of genocide. We read often about the gas chambers, torture, starvation, disease, intolerable conditions in camps, and so on. But there are also indirect causes of, or more indirect causes of genocide. And one of them is the manipulation of reproductive life to eliminate the Jewish people. And it's based on, if you look at the Genocide Convention of 1948, one of the articles that described, defined genocide is imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. And this is very much what was part of the Nazi policy. My book deals with reproductive life in two ways. There is half of the book deals with childbearing and issues such as pregnancy, birth, abortion, sterilization of women. And the other half deals with sexuality, the sexual contact of women, issues like prostitution or sex work, rape, sexual abuse. And I will deal mainly with the sexuality issues in today's talk. One of the questions that was challenging at the beginning was the question of rape of Jewish women, and it was often suggested that, oh, that didn't really occur. David O'Leary's drawings, he was a prisoner in Auschwitz, actually show many issues and pictures depicting the rape of Jewish women. But the question that asked is, were women protected by the Rassenschande laws? And the answer is no. Despite the fact that survivors were often reluctant to report about rape or sex, us as researchers were reluctant to explore the issue. We simply didn't ask women, and in gaining testimonies from them, for example. And there is huge difficulty in searching the archives. It's quite hard to get access to this information. But rape of women did occur, Jewish women did occur. It occurred everywhere, in hiding, in prisons, in ghettos, in camps, perpetrated by Wehrmacht soldiers, guards, the SS, non-German civilians. It occurred in brothels and in private homes. Sometimes, a few instances that I came across, it was perpetrated by Jewish men. Women of all ages were raped, and in multiple countries. And rape occurred both in public and in private. Some women survived and testified. Some testified about other women that they saw being raped. Some women remained silent, and many were murdered. But if we look through a little bit chronologically, in the ghettos, despite the abject poverty or despair, the abnormality of life, romance happened, marriages still occurred, there was flirting, life continued in some ways as normal, but some women also, as conditions became worse and worse, some women had to resort to sex work, to prostitution, to try to gain some form of money and survival. Roundups occurred in ghettos, in towns, and in villages, as we know, and these were accompanied by beatings, by public births. Women were sometimes made to give birth in public if they were in labor at the time of the roundups, just for the stimulation of those, the SS or whoever were rounding them up, out of curiosity. Some babies were hit against the walls to kill them, or the babies were thrown from maternity wards onto the trucks below. Babies were used for target practice. Pregnant women were often eviscerated, and children and women were raped. Part of this process of rounding them up often involved body searches, internal searches of women's bodies. And as Sylvia Gross-Martin writes, she said, I had seen women completely naked with their legs spread in a knee bent position, their upper body bent all the way down. They stood motionless with everything exposed, their faces to the wall, and the guards did the examining. Obviously, they were looking for jewelry, but in a process, they were digitally raping these women. Sexual humiliation continued into the camps. And as Marion mentioned, bodily hair would be shaved, names were replaced with numbers, their identity was eliminated. They had to wear identifying badges. Nudity was common. They were often made to parade naked or be assessed naked. Internal searches continued. And of course, they were overworked, beaten, and starved. But some of the worst situations in which, or worst, you can't judge, some of the situations in which sex occurred in the camps were in the latrines, the Auschwitz latrines, for example. And Terence Dupre talks of this as excremental assault, these latrines. In the camps, the romance sometimes occurred, although contact was often prohibited. But also sexual exchange took place, the bartering of sex to go and earn something that might help them to survive. And with workmen who came into the camps or senior people in the camps, the cooks, for example, it was possible to sometimes exchange sex in order to get a shoelace or a scrap of bread. And this is where much of the sexual contact for exchange usually took place. Now, the Germans had instituted a statewide controlled, and in multi-countries, every country they went into, a state-controlled network of brothels. And the purpose of these was partly to satisfy the needs of German soldiers, to provide an incentive for higher productivity, and to avoid soldiers' infection. During the First World War, many of the German soldiers had been infected with sexually transmitted infections. And this was one way of trying to prevent this by controlling the brothels where they could monitor the sex workers. And some have suggested that brothels provided an acceptable sexual outlet for the enormous exposure to nudity that occurred in the camps. Because prostitution also occurred in the camps, brothels were created in a number of the camps. And prisoners, women could volunteer. They were offered better living conditions, which is true for the few months that they might live, but otherwise they were volunteered. Each man would have 15 minutes with the woman. A woman might be raped by 8 to 40 men in one session, one evening or one day. Bells would signal when the men could go into the room and when they had to finish. There were peepholes in the doors so that the guards could check what was happening. Men would pay what was equivalent of a week's work to be with a woman. And any infections in the woman or pregnancy that might result from this usually meant the woman was killed. And the brothels were usually open to Germans and foreigners. But Jewish women were also forced to serve as prostitutes in these concentration camps, military brothels. There are a number of testimonies that have emerged of these women, but one of the most distinctive is of a couple who was reunited after the war, and she had been tattooed with the words "prostitute for the armies of Hitler." And they applied to Rabbi Oshry in 1949 for a halachic ruling, which he gave, permitting Jewish women who were forced to work as prostitutes to resume their marital lives. It's some of the best evidence for the fact that this did happen. Abuse and brutality were common. The Einsatzgruppen also were part of the raping perpetrators. There were individuals, and both men and women were known to abuse and rape. In prisons, rape occurred. Klaus Barbie is one of the most famous of these perpetrators. He would beat women when they were naked, torture them, and he would mutilate their breasts, but he would also train his dogs to mount the women. There was sexual brutality in the camps. Ivan Demjanjuk in Treblinka was known for stabbing women around the thighs and raping them. Tauber in Auschwitz would select women for the brothels based on whether they had drooping breasts or not, and he would walk down the lines flipping their breasts with a whip to see if they would move too much. And Ilse Kochen-Buchenwald was renowned for her debauchery and the tattoos, her tattooed skins that she would collect from prisoners that she noted in the camps. Irma Grieser, the bitch of Belsen, he was in Ravensbrück, in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. She was responsible for 30,000 Jewish female prisoners at times. And she was known for savaging prisoners with trained dogs, for sexual excesses herself, for arbitrary shootings of people, and selecting prisoners for the gas chambers. The doctors who worked in some of these camps reported that she became sexually aroused when watching breast surgery, and she used to request that the doctors called her when there was breast surgery going on. And even more so, she would go through the camps with a plaited whip and beat the breasts of women so that they would become infected and then have to go for surgery to clean the wounds, when she would want to watch. Other camps in Flossenburg, which was a camp to which many of the homosexuals were sent, the commandant himself was noted to have become sexually aroused while he was watching homosexuals beaten, which he often then perpetrated. But it wasn't only women, but children who were abused as women. And this is a second book which I wrote on child sex abuse in the Holocaust. And in this, I came across 160 children whose stories I could tell. The average age of the children that I was reported in the book was 11 years old. So they ranged from about 5 to 15, and I didn't look any older than that. It was a difficult book to write because the subject is taboo. And that was the very first word that was told to me when I first went to an archive, actually in Israel. And the archivist said to me, you know, the subject is taboo. Of course, you'll never get access to the archives. And it's true that some of the archives did refuse to let me in. The comments that were passed, or the arguments that were put to this, was that it's not necessary to talk about these things. It's degrading to the memory of the Holocaust. Or that's impossible. Never would a German, an SS soldier, touch a Jewish girl. It was forbidden, the Russian Schande concern. Concerns about re-traumatizing the victim or their family, especially if the family could identify the victim. And that led to huge concerns about retaining women's privacy, which I did in the book. And horror to think that such things happened, or disbelief of children's stories. Children who told stories that they'd been sexually abused were discounted. They were not believed. What could you know about such things? It was told to them. And there was fear that some of this information could be misused by Holocaust deniers or revisionists. But I always came back to the bottom line that I thought women and children who told their stories wanted them to be known. Otherwise, they would not have reported them. They might well have wanted to have privacy about their identities, but they certainly wanted their experiences to be recognized and to be known. And we have ignored these up to now. Where did child sex abuse occur? Everywhere. In homes, in ghettos, in labor camps and extermination camps. Some children in medical experiments were sexually manipulated. Children who were in hiding were sexually abused. The Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht were known for attacking children. Among the Kindertransport children, I found a number of testimonies of children who'd been abused in their families that had taken them on, look after them. Children sent to safety beyond Europe's borders, and children in the DP camps. And some of the children were abused simply as Jews, or while they were passing for Aryan. These are some of the major categories. I had 29 children who were abused in hiding, 26 who were abused by soldiers, 22 talking about sexual abuse in the ghettos, and 15 girls in camps and 17 boys in camps are some of the stories included in the book. Just to give you an example, the story of Melania Weissenberg, or her book is called Molly's Diary. She was hidden together with an older cousin of hers, Helene, underground in a hole in the ground, which was the size of perhaps a double bed on which they could lie down, but she couldn't sit up. And she and her sister were kept there for 2 years. She was helped by a farmer, Victor Wojcik, and his sister. And they became afraid sometime during their period of hiding that Victor was losing interest or was becoming fearful of being discovered and himself being killed for hiding them. And they decided to entice him to exchange sex in order to keep them alive and keep feeding them and looking after them, which they did do. And she reported this in her diary. By the way, I think she is still alive. Another incident, Susie Berghofer and her sister Lotte, they were 3 years old when they were sent on the Kindertransport to England. They were sheltered by a reverend man and his wife Irene. He began to sexually abuse Susie from the time she was 9 years old. And she complied with this because she was terrified that they would stop looking after her twin sister who was ill and ailing. He prevented her having contact with older boys or men. She eventually dated and married in secret, And in 1988, many years later, she entered therapy and began to wonder where she had come from on the Kindertransport, where she'd come from in Europe. And she eventually discovered her Jewish origins. The Reverend and his wife had never told her. And he was never, his story became exposed at that point. And he was never formally charged for his crimes. What happened after the war? Women survivors were treated with suspicion. And the thought was, did they use sexual behavior to survive? One story is of a woman who was catching a bus in Israel, and she reached up to hold on for support, and her sleeve fell down, revealing her Auschwitz tattoo. And someone nearby her turned around and said, "Oh, isn't it interesting how only the pretty and the young girls managed to survive?" Obviously implying she had used sex in order to survive. Women kept silent about their experiences, even from their partners. Many had never told their partners for decades that they had been sexually abused. And many of the women report never enjoying sex in their lives after the war. How could this happen? In our normal world, we require an explanation. And some of the theories we've come up with as to how could people do this is authoritarianism, or that they just simply were obeying orders, anti-Semitism, or that the society had become morally disengaged. They distanced themselves from these actions. It was not relevant to them, or simply that it was because of self-interest. But if we think about the Nazis in their own time, they viewed such acts as normal and desirable. They thought their actions were heroic, were admired, were praiseworthy. Their actions were not incongruent with their normal selves. It was in keeping with their personal sense of integrity. They believed that this whole process of the Holocaust, what they were doing was right. Major General Globocnik in 1942 gave a speech, and in the speech he said, "But gentlemen, if after us such a cowardly and rotten generation should arise that it does not understand our work, which is so good and so necessary, then, gentlemen, all National Socialism will have been for nothing. On the contrary, bronze plaques should be put up with the inscription that it was we who had the courage to achieve this gigantic task." And Hitler agreed with him. This concern of rape during war is a global concern. Rape is currently a spoil of war. It's a reward for soldiers, or it's used as a weapon of war to dehumanize the other, make it easier to kill them and to humiliate them. Sexual slavery is a problem. Sexualized cruelty is a problem globally, and sexual trafficking for economic gain is something that we face every day today. If we step back a little bit, just to conclude, Yael Danieli, an Israeli writer and scholar, put together the idea that there are 4 blows that shatter the belief that humanity has that we are really good people. And the first of these, she says, came from the cosmological blow, as Copernicus put out the idea that we are not the center of the universe. The biological blow came from Darwin, when he claimed that mankind's supremacy over the animal kingdom was in question. The psychological blow came later from Freud, where he put out the idea that the ego is not the master of the psyche. We don't control all our actions in our conscious world. And the ethical blow was the last that Danieli put together, that the Nazis destroyed the idea that our world is a just place. I've added the ideological blow, that ideologies, including some formalized religions as opposed to spiritual people, and acts perpetrated within such often extremist frameworks, have led to our moral, ethical, and spiritual impoverishment. As Father Patrick Desbois writes, an ideology can deceive minds to the point of annihilating all ethical reflexes and all recognition of the human in the other. I am convinced that there is only one race, a human race that shoots 2-year-old children. And I've added to that, and abuses them physically, emotionally, and sexually first. And I write these books with respect to the women and the children who experienced sexual abuse during and after the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that paper. I'm sure it raised a number of questions for people, so do post in the chat and I will pick them up at the end. So our third and final paper today is from Dr. Boaz Cohen. Dr. Boaz Cohen is head of the Holocaust Studies program of the Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel. He also teaches at the Shannon College in Haifa and is an affiliated research fellow at the Center for Collective Violence, Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the UCL Institute for Advanced Studies. His work focuses on the development of Holocaust memory and historiography in their social and cultural context, and on Jewish and Israeli post-Holocaust society. His current research focuses on work with survivor children after the Holocaust, their rehabilitation, and the collection of their testimonies. And today, Dr. Cohen is presenting his paper, Lena Kuchler and Her 100 Children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a minute, I'll put my stopwatch. We had perpetrators, then we had sexual abuse, and now I want to talk about one woman. And the question of theorizing will come up here at the end. But I want to tell a story of a woman who did not get enough recognition at her time, but neither did men who did such work. And this is Lena Kuchler. I'll explain who she is, and then I'll start getting into in depth. So this is in small letters. I'll say it. She grew up. She was born 1910. Studied in Krakow. Started academic studies too. She was on her way to a PhD. She had to stop because she had no money, and she worked as a teacher. When during the Holocaust, she lost a daughter, and her husband left her. He said his chances of survival are better without her. And she managed to get a fake documents. She went to Warsaw. From Warsaw, she went with the Polish family of some sort of well-to-do family with a farm, a noble family. And she went, she was with them, and she was teaching their children. After the war, she opened the school for all the school children, and then she came back to Krakow. Now, she comes back to Krakow, she finds out no one is left from the family. She does find a brother who is high up in the communist hierarchy, and she has somewhere to live. She lives with him. And she's asked to come back to the university and to finish a PhD. She's working on child perceptions of spatiality and cognition and this stuff. And one day, accidentally, so she says, she went to the Jewish Commission in Krakow, and she saw that now Jewish committees were places where all the Jewish survivors coalesced, and there was it was like a terrible place. A lot of people shouting, trying to find relatives, trying to get aid. And in the top floor, there were children who the committee collected or were brought by the non-Jews who sheltered them. And they live in terrible conditions, and it's really terrible. And this changes her life. She's offered to take care of the children. She answers with an idea to take them to the country, to Zakopane, which is a resort, get a place there, renovate it, and give them a home. With this is done. I will not say now how she gets the money for all this, but she has to get the funding. Although this is a community effort, no one has the money for this. She's in Zakopane. It's very nice, except for two small problems. A lot of anti-Semitism in the schools. She can't send the children to school because they're being attacked. And then they are being attacked by nationalist militias, attacked with weapons and grenades. And we're talking about armed attacks. Now, when you read their books, you think maybe this is just a lot of drama. But actually, we are talking about, we have a research now on what goes on in Zakopane after the Holocaust. We have a Carolina Pants has done name by name of victims and name by name of attackers. And so she finds a way to smuggle the whole group to Czechoslovakia, from there to France. And then she reaches Eretz Israel in 1949. The children are growing up. Some of them are together. She's with them for 2 years. Then she has a life, gets married, and at the age of 40 plus gives birth to a girl. And she has a child. One child she did have. Okay, so this is just an overview. Her general message is, approach to the children is that it's all about trust. When we talk today about children at risk, we have to remember children who came out of the Holocaust, maybe they underwent what Bev was talking about. They lose their faith in humanity. I mean, even when we hear such a presentation like yours, we lose our faith in humanity, but they have a very good personal reasons to lose them. Also, they are truants, they are street urchins, they are violent, some are like that, some are apathic. The adults don't exactly know what to do with these people, with these children. And and they want to throw some of the children out because they are delinquents. And she says all these children lost their faith in humanity because at an early age, they saw only the evil in people. All people were perceived as evil unless proven otherwise. So this is the way these children look at the world. And she has this challenge to find a way to change this. And this is a bit about the children, but again, she says, these children survived the war by stealing and lying. It was their best weapon during the war. After they lost security, family, community, home, they will obviously not throw this is my mistake, away now that the war is over. So you can't teach these children about ethics. You can't demand certain behaviors from them. You have to to give them time to educate them, help them regain trust. So the issue of trust is always very strong in all this, but also, as you will see, she has a very, I would not say, maybe feminine approach to how to work with these children. These are boys and girls, yes? And the ages are from toddlers or a bit more to 15-year-olds. This is Jacopana. This is the home she gets. How did she manage to finance the move to Jacopana? And now what we can see is that she's very good at kicking doors. She goes to the Russian authorities in Krakow. In the end, she gets a truckload of sugar. And this is a currency in the black market. And with this truckload of sugar, they rent this house and renovate it for the children. And these are photos of armed children. Some of the children, maybe not these ages, really did use weapons in defending the home against attacks. Not only adults were defending, but also young 11-year-olds, 14-year-olds who were in the partisans and who knew how to use weapons. So she has a very interesting approach that what these children need is not an institution, they need a home, a family. And the first story that is interesting is that when she first comes to the children, she brings sandwiches. When the children get to Jacopana, they enter the dining room and it's all set with china plates and shiny cutlery. And there's a lot of bread, a lot of food. This is something that happens all over, that you need to give the children as much bread as they want, not ration it. And now the interesting thing is she talks a lot about this special meal, first meal in the children's home. But the children also talk about it. There's a 2003 movie about Lena Kuchler and her children. And they took 7 of the children back to Poland. It's done by Osha Schwartz. It's an amazing movie, it has English subtitles. They take them back to Poland and they tell her whole story. And they also found TV programs she did with teenagers in Israel. And anyway, this guy, Nathan, he stands there in the movie and he gives the whole menu of the meal. He said, I will never forget it until the day I die. And he doesn't forget it. He gives the full menu of that meal. I mean, the idea that there is food, what I said, food is love. The main point that guides her work is the issue of mother. She sees herself as this children's mother. I mean, it starts off with the children calling her mother. And in the end, it turned out that many of the children were calling her mother. And she was interviewed in 1946 by David Boder. The transcript is up there on the web, also the recording. She speaks in 2 languages or 3. My feelings towards the children is the feeling of a mother toward the children born to her, maybe even deeper. I protect these children. I will go on protecting them as long as they are with me. Now, this issue of protecting the children, she is the only, she smuggles the whole children's home out of Poland because of danger to the children. When they are in France, she moves the children from one Jewish organization, the one who took her from Poland, and to another one because she's not happy with the treatment the children are getting. She is fighting for the children. This is a major, now, I will talk later about what this means, fighting with institutions, but she explains who she took as staff. And she tells these women, you lost your children in Auschwitz. You don't have the children to hug. But these children who do not have their parents, we should become true mothers to these children. So the catchword is being a mother. And that's the way she treats. And this also means that the children's home is a family. We don't have an institute. The child wants to live when they're in France. He wants to go to Eretz Israel. She says, we don't have an institution. You can't leave it. We have a family. We all lost our families, so we established a new family composed of many children and mothers. So she has many examples, but I want to move to the context and to the questions. So I'm an historian, so theorizing is not my forte. And I'm also not sure what I want to theorize from this, but I will say several things. First of all, she's not alone. I've written a paper about in Holocaust and Genocide Studies about Holocaust, about women caretakers, survivor caretakers, women survivor caretakers, and survivor children, where I track the story of 3 women. She's one of them, and there are others. So how much is this story representative? She was an amazing woman, but can we generalize from it something for the future? I'll say one word about it in then. She stresses the issue of mother. Now, I saw in the Yad Vashem site when they were writing about her, they were using the term surrogate mothers. Now, I never heard her or any other caretaker talking about herself as a surrogate mother. She had to be motherly or a mother for the children, but the term surrogate mother, which is maybe will be a professional term here, this is not something that you hear these women talking about. And then men. What is she wrote a lot, Lena Kuchler. She recorded the children's experiences. She published books. A main book is which was translated to many languages is My 100 Children. She was not happy with any of the translations, but it was translated. There's a Hollywood movie, sort of a feature movie done on her. But she writes a lot, and her papers are in the ghetto fighter's house. And so she describes the work. So what is the place of men in this story? First, you have the first man is her husband who leaves her during the war and wants to come back after the war, but she refuses. We have the men where she's hiding who are hitting on her, but not, at least as she tells it, nothing of, it doesn't go past flirting. But she is working with institutions, the Jewish Committee, the procurement office of the Soviet authorities, the school superintendent in the Zakopane area, whom she succeeds in bringing to the Zakopane schools to force the teachers to take the Jewish children to accept them to schools. And she needs the superintendent for this. And he comes. So she, in a way, she is very adept at getting people to enlist in her projects, to work for her projects. And I think this is an important point. Another issue that is a concern to men is what happens with men caretakers. You know, we hear a lot about women in the Holocaust. We also hear that women were adapting much better than men, and we hear a lot of stories like that. I just learned that a young researcher in Israel is now doing a postdoc in Yad Vashem, writing about fathers in the Holocaust. We have nothing about fathers in the Holocaust, although there are a lot of memoirs, both by fathers and by children who were with their fathers. This is one thing. Another thing is, what about men caretakers? They obviously didn't adopt the mother role, but what role did they adopt? And can we say that women were always successful and motherly, and men were more disciplinarian and aloof? I don't know. We don't have research. We have a lot of sources on women caretakers. We have, and I've written some other people have looked at this, but no one has looked at men. And I think this, if we get the masculine angle, we might have a much better picture of what it was really going on and how to assess or evaluate the work of women, female caretakers, male caretakers, mothers and fathers, etc. So I will stop here and leave time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. They were three very different perspectives on gender and the Holocaust. So I think it's going to have raised quite a few interesting questions and some that may bridge all three, but some that may be more individual. I found it quite interesting there, the kind of move from perpetrators to sexual violence to rehabilitation. Transition between those three topics was quite difficult. In terms of, I suppose, thinking my own way through issues of gender in what I study as well. I will turn the floor over to questions. I'm just looking at what we have here. Okay, so it's jumped me back down to the bottom, so bear with me 1 second. So there's a question here, which I think is for Professor Peto here. Double victimhood theory Did this lead to the double genocide theory used now in Lithuania and other Eastern European countries to downplay the Holocaust and equating Lithuanian suffering under the Soviets with the Holocaust?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I posted an article which I wrote about the paradigm change in Holocaust memorialization, where I actually identified 7 steps, what is happening now in the European context, changing the Holocaust narrative. And definitely this is one of the important elements, namely that with the European Union enlargement, this part of Europe had become a part of the European community, which had experienced the Soviet occupation. Therefore, from this point onwards, there had been very strong attempts to somehow de-universalize the Holocaust narrative and to somehow minimalize and to make it comparable to the Soviet occupation. And the Baltic states, of course, were the first ones, and the Hungarian government jumped on this bandwagon in 2010, and especially in 2014 with the Holocaust Memorial Year. And I wrote a lot about this, so if you're interested, you can look it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump down a little bit to share the questions among speakers rather than do all at once. So if I've missed your question, I'm going to return to it. But this one is for Professor Chalmers. What are your sources for Greece? A lot of these claims are questioned. If it's just Pearl that you are using, did you want to offer a response to that? Thank you.
I would have to resort to the book. I have a couple of thousand references in there, and I do not have them off the top of my head. So they are in the book, the references that I used.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so bear with me, it jumps down again. Technology is not my my preference for these days. So here's a question for Professor Cohen here. How long did the homes operate for? What happened to the children, and what happened to Lena and the other mothers? Thank you.
I will answer also the question before that. I'm very aware of the work of my Magdalena. We've worked together, and I mean, we've been in touch more than once, and I think she's doing an amazing work. I just hope to see it published sometime. I think it's very important that people are looking at the work of these amazing women. And now I'll answer about the homes. We are talking about with Lena Kuchler, for example, we're talking about the immediate post-Holocaust years. She starts at 46 or even 45. I think 46. In 46, she also is, maybe she starts 45. 46, they escape from Poland and they smuggle the border from Poland. She moves on to France. She has to wait for the establishment of the State of Israel to be able to get to Israel. And then many of the children, the grown-ups, have already moved by themselves. And she's left with a group of 34 children. They are all taken into one agricultural settlement in Israel, Kvutzat Schiller, the Schiller group. And they have built a home for them. And she is with them for the first 1 or 2 years until they get settled. Then she moves to the town, to Givatayim, and her home becomes a center for these children. She is in touch with these children until her death. They come, they bring she is in their weddings, they bring their children. Now, this is interesting because this happens in other children's homes. I mean, there's a small group of caretakers, women in this case, where the children one group celebrated the 90th birthday of their caretaker a few years ago. So some of them were already dead, so their children came. So the connections are real. They exist also after the institutional phase. So this is, I say, generally children's homes were there until children grew up. We see them all over Europe. They are the homes that manage to move the children to Eretz Israel. They get, many of them get to kibbutzim, and we have on our site, on the site where you register, there's an amazing recording from our last event of Miki Dror, who researched one group like that, who came from a children's home, go to the kibbutz, and they are there still as a very close-knit group. So some connections went on, some connections disappeared, but all work with children always ends when they grow up. I mean, there's one stage where they stop being children, and then you have to take them to another seminar. They don't belong to this seminar anymore.
Thank you. Another question here for Professor Peto. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you could say more about your notion of anti-modernist emancipation and how you position that in the framework of reading of fascism as modern and modernist, albeit clearly positing an alternative modernity to the liberal socialist ones that we typically read as modernist.
Thank you. I sent a longer version of this response. It is in the chat. You can download that. So basically, I was in my work, I was handling the fascism as the modern, this anti-modernist, modern, following Roger Griffin's argumentation. And if I read the stories of these women, so how do they explain that? Why did they join this movement and not the leftist movement or the social democratic movement? So what made them joining this particular movement? It's pretty obvious that they wanted to make change. The doctors, the medical doctors, they were appalled by the poverty which is out there. And for them, the leftist social democratic alternative was not an option because of two reasons. First, because after the First World War, in the leftist and social democratic movements were blamed for the loss of the First World War. This is very much like the Dolchstoss mise in Hungary, and secondly, because of the violent anti-Semitism. So for them, the social democratic and the trade union movement was not really an option. Therefore, they try to be active in these movements and to implement change there, to educate women, to improve social conditions. And also it was as I wrote to the question by Boaz, this was the Arrow Cross Party which first submitted a bill in the Hungarian parliament to punish sexual violence in the workplace. So this kind of which hasn't been on the agenda of any kind of other political movements, but this the Arrow Cross Party, of course, with the racial undertone, saying that the kind of honest, nice, innocent Hungarian working women should be protected from the Jewish capitalists who are exploiting the workforce. So and this kind of exclusionarist narrative was very attracted a lot of women, and they were not only fee-paying members but also supporters of the Arrow Cross Party. And why is this important here and now? It is important here and now when we want to understand why so many women voted for Trump. If you look at the recent elections, there is a fantastic gender gap. More than 52% of the women voted for Trump. So you need to explain this, and also you have to explain why the modernism, which is considered to be the normal, the new normal, is losing constant support. And in that sense, I tried to write this book explaining that these women who were so many in the Holocaust party, that at a certain point, the conservative press was speaking about the Holocaust party as a feminist party. They were using this term feminist, that they are feminist. And this is the worst label you can imagine in the conservative, Christian conservative Hungarian context, that these women actually wanted to implement change. So this revolutionary modernism based on exclusion and also controlling the very limited resources which were available. So in that sense, I think we can learn from these analogies and from this historical comparison when we are trying to understand our today's world, why so many women are voting for those politicians and those political movements who we would otherwise would consider misogynist and hateful and racist. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. There's a couple of questions that I want to pose at the same time to Professor Chalmers. The first is a question on how you deal with survivor testimony that you cannot cross-reference with another source, and why you think the stories of rape have taken so very long to surface, or has this been buried in historic works and not generally available to the public?
Okay, the first question about the inability to cross-reference survivor testimony. Yes, each testimony is individual and you cannot always cross-reference it with any other documentation. But in the kind of work that I've done, I've searched for trends and patterns, so that I will, if I come across a single survivor testimony, that is one person, very valid, but it's one person's experience. When I start to read dozens and dozens of reports, then I begin to think there is a trend, there's a pattern of what actually was happening here that we can find. When I was working on birth, sex and abuse, I was looking for women's experiences of rape, and I kept coming across these anecdotes about children who'd been raped. And it was only after reading dozens of them that I decided that this was something that hadn't been openly exposed and that I needed to search for, which led me into writing the second book. So yes, you cannot cross-reference every testimony, but you can see if that story is fairly common among a number of people, which lends it a little bit more generalizability. Not validity, because every person's story is individual and is valid. But if you're looking for patterns of what happened, you need to find many more stories that corroborate that issue. The other question is, why has the question of rape not come to the surface before now? And is this buried in history? I don't think so. I think we have to think back to the time that was at that time and how women were brought up. Women were very much less willing to discuss such personal, intimate details. It was a very much more conservative society, and one didn't talk about these things. In addition, women who immediately after the war had been raped or abused wouldn't tell their partners, because in a way it was emasculating for men. And that's, it led to their inability to protect their women or their wives. Was often cited as a reason why women didn't want to tell their husbands, because it would make them feel bad. And that's in fact what is happening today in war. The deliberate intention is to rape women so that the men feel emasculated, and it's a part of the weaponry that is used to against the enemy, is to degrade them and humiliate them. And I think that was some of the story behind rape then. But the other side of it too, as I said, is that we didn't ask about these things. When the Yale University, the Fortunoff Library archives were developed and the testimonies were created, it was specifically told to the women that these stories were really for their families to read and for their children to get to know what had happened to them, to record it for posterity. And women didn't want their children to know that they'd been raped. So nobody asked them, were you sexually harassed? Did you have any sexual encounters? That was not part of the questionnaires. By the time the Shoah Foundation started, much later, then there were more explicit exploratory questions about what had happened. And women who chose to tell the story but asked that it not be made public could say so. And those testimonies are the ones that are in archives but are private. You cannot access them. And these are the ones that I had the most difficulty with when I approached various archives. I must admit, this is a Ghetto Fighters House series, and the Ghetto Fighters House was phenomenal in allowing me access to these stories, obviously provided I would retain the privacy and secrecy of the testimonies' name, so it doesn't embarrass them or their families. I omitted, which is a non-historical way of doing things, but I left out details about their identity and where they, particularly specifics of where they live, in order to make it impossible for anyone reading the book to access their private information. I have the codes of whose testimonies I used, but you cannot access them through the book in order to preserve privacy. If women had personally written about their stories in books or testimonies or memoirs, I would use their names and their places and details, but not if they had requested privacy for their testimonies. But to get access to them was difficult. The libraries didn't make it easy for me, put it that way. Of about 13 different libraries in Canada that I tried to access, I could only get them through one. In Israel, I did manage to get through the Ghetto Fighters House and a couple of others, but not a lot. Very difficult access in Israel. I don't know if that answers your questions. Rape, I think, is just something we didn't talk about until recently. It's very much a modern, the last few decades, when we feel more free to express things about rape and sexual abuse. And obviously we see things like the Me Too movement coming now. This is a modern phenomenon where we are exposing sexual interactions, and especially those that are derogatory, in a much more public way than we have been able to. So I don't think these stories are lost in history. I just don't think history's been ready to look at them until now.
Thank you very much. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. I'm going to now hand over to the organisers. Thank you. It was an absolute privilege chairing this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for chairing. And I would like to also thank our three fascinating presenters, panelists, for an amazing and fascinating, somewhat depressing presentations, but really thank you so much for this informative presentations and for this fascinating panel. And I would like to give the floor to Boaz Cohen to conclude this session and this whole event, and to thank you all for coming. Boaz?
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank first the organizing team, which is Roni and Andrea and Jan and Yaron, because a lot of people ask me, how does Western Galilee, which is a very small college, run such an amazing program with so many participants and so many great researchers presenting? And the answer is that I have an online team. This is the answer. And these are who volunteer to do this. And as we all volunteer for the extra teaching projects we do. And it is thanks to them that we can do this, and also their input. It's not only about organizing. I mean, I was pushing all the time to do a project, a seminar on gender and Holocaust. I thought it was very important to do it. But Ron is the one who made sure I knew about International Women's Day, which is not really regularly on my calendar. So it was really important that we build this, and I really want to thank all of you for this. And there were mentions here of, there is amazing research on children's home by Daniela Dron on France, by Joanna Miklitz on Poland, by Emuna Nachmani Gafni on Poland. There is research. What I'm trying to do is to look at the stuff, to look at the people who are running it. And in this case, the woman who is running it. I'm interested in how they approach the work, not only the experiences of the children, which are of course important. And I think we all know that it has become like being in, today being a researcher and Zoom is like being in a candy shop, someone said. There's so many events, all of them at the same time. And you can spend all your whole days or attending events or listening to recordings. I heard of someone who falls asleep with recording. The fact that we are able to build a platform where researchers are attending, and young and more veteran researchers who are exchanging views, who are presenting. We give the floor to people at the beginning of their career and to people who are already well known. And I think this is an amazing opportunity we have, and this is what pushes us to keep doing this. It's not having this platform where researchers can speak and be heard. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next month. I know that maybe Daniela wants me already to mention the next event. Bear with me a minute. I'm sorry, I plan to open this invitation before the, okay, so we are talking about the next event. The next month's event is on April 6th. We will have an event on new avenues in Eastern European Holocaust research with Dr. Yurychenko and Dr. Wade-Born, speaking about the Ustasha and about the Janowska concentration camp. So this is what we are looking forward to. On May, we will have a conference on not only Holocaust, but also Holocaust ego documents, and an event of Ghetto Fighters House, which we cooperate on, for the Children's Museum on Children in the Holocaust. We all come together again to the same subjects, and we put out a call for papers. If you didn't notice, then look for it or ask us. A call for papers for a conference on June 22. You already know why. July 22, sorry. You know why we are having this conference. It's about Barbarossa and the beginning of mass murder. So this one is with call for papers and applications and stuff. So it will be held on Zoom, but you are invited to apply. Thank you all, goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.